The global order has just been jolted again. A single move from Washington is sending shockwaves through economies, alliances, and even entire regions. Nations that once counted on America's markets now find themselves on the edge of an economic storm. And at the center of it all, one man, one decision, and one strategy. Welcome to Shadows of Strategy, where we break down the moves that define the future of global power. President Donald Trump has unleashed what many are calling a trade tsunami. In just days, sweeping new tariffs, some as high as 50%, have been slapped on a range of countries, from India and Brazil to select European partners. What makes this moment so significant is not just the economic impact, but the political message behind it. Trump is making it clear: the United States will no longer accept what he calls unfair partnerships and strategic freeloading. The tariffs are massive and targeted. Indian pharmaceuticals, textiles, and automotive components. Industries that depend heavily on U.S. market access are now facing crippling costs. Brazil, which has been under Washington's radar for its ties with China and ongoing political instability, has seen its agricultural exports hit hard. Soybeans, beef, and sugar shipments are now under punishing tariffs. Even European steel and technology exports have been dragged into this new wave of trade restrictions. For Trump, this is not just about economics. This is about power. He argues that countries like India and Brazil cannot seek the benefits of U.S. trade while simultaneously doing deals with America's rivals, especially China and Russia. By hitting allies and partners with economic pain, Trump is forcing them into a choice: align more closely with Washington or pay the price. The ripple effects are immediate. In New Delhi, the government is scrambling to respond. India has long relied on the U.S. as its largest export market, and losing that access could devastate sectors that employ millions. Yet, India is also reluctant to abandon its energy deals with Russia or its role in BRICS, where it finds growing alternatives to Western-led financial systems. Brazil faces a similar dilemma, already politically fragile, with former President Jair Bolsonaro facing coup-related trials. Brazil cannot afford a prolonged trade war. Yet it also doesn't want to fully give up its ties with Beijing, which remains Brazil's top trading partner. Trump's tariffs are therefore more than economic. They are a direct intervention in Brazil's strategic orientation. Europe, too, has been caught in the storm. Tariffs on steel and technology exports have reignited tensions across the Atlantic. For leaders in Berlin and Paris, the message is clear. Trump is not interested in returning to the old transatlantic consensus. Instead, he is demanding concessions and loyalty, using America's vast market as leverage. Global markets have reacted sharply. Stock prices of major Indian pharmaceutical firms and Brazilian agricultural exporters have plunged. European companies tied to steel and machinery have seen investor confidence falter. Meanwhile, the U.S. dollar has surged as investors seek safety, further strengthening America's economic position in the short term. But the real story lies in the geopolitical consequences. Trump's trade tsunami is reshaping alliances. In Moscow, officials are celebrating. Every U.S. tariff that pushes India or Brazil further away from Washington creates more space for Russia to deepen economic and military ties. China, too, benefits by presenting itself as a partner willing to buy what America rejects. Beijing has already signaled readiness to increase agricultural imports from Brazil and expand technology cooperation with Europe, exploiting the cracks in U.S. alliances. Inside the United States, Trump's move has divided opinion. Business groups are alarmed, warning that these tariffs could disrupt supply chains, raise costs for American consumers, and spark retaliation. Yet Trump's base sees it differently. They view it as a bold reassertion of U.S. strength, putting America first, forcing allies and rivals alike to stop exploiting the system. The administration's messaging is clear. These tariffs will not be lifted until partner nations realign their strategic priorities. In other words, unless India distances itself from Russia, unless Brazil loosens ties with China. And unless Europe falls fully back in line with Washington, the economic pain will continue. Diplomatic channels are now buzzing with activity. European leaders are considering limited countermeasures, but are cautious about triggering a full trade war. India is quietly exploring retaliation on U.S. agricultural imports while deepening talks with Russia and the Gulf states for alternative markets. Brazil, caught between domestic turmoil and international pressure, is struggling to craft a coherent response. What makes this moment so volatile is the unpredictability. Trump thrives on creating uncertainty, keeping allies and rivals guessing about his next move. That unpredictability is now a weapon, one that forces governments worldwide to prepare for sudden shocks. The broader question is whether this strategy will ultimately strengthen U.S. global power or isolate it. On one hand, America still holds the world's largest consumer market, giving Washington unmatched leverage. On the other, pushing too many partners into the arms of Beijing and Moscow could accelerate the multipolar shift Trump himself claims to oppose. Already, think tanks in New Delhi and Sao Paulo are warning of a future where U.S. trade becomes too unreliable, prompting countries to hedge with non-Western institutions like BRICS or the Eurasian Economic Union. Europe, too, is reviving calls for strategic autonomy. The idea that the EU should reduce dependence on Washington for both trade and defense. Yet, Trump appears unfazed. At a recent press briefing, he dismissed criticism, saying, "America will no longer carry the burden of others' choices. If our partners want access to our markets, they must respect our interests." For his supporters, it's a clear message of strength. For his critics, it's a dangerous gamble that could fracture decades-old alliances. This is not just about tariffs. It's about forcing nations to reveal where they truly stand in the global order. Will India break from Russia? Will Europe recommit to the US? Will Brazil abandon its growing ties with China? These are the choices that Trump's trade tsunami is forcing onto the table. And as history has shown, economic wars can sometimes be more destabilizing than military ones. They reshape industries, topple governments, and redraw alliances. The coming months may determine not only the future of U.S. trade policy, but the very structure of global geopolitics. One thing is certain: the world is entering uncharted waters. And every nation must decide whether to swim with Washington's current or be swept away by it.